All right, well, it looks like it's 2 o'clock to me, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Bell, and I'm the Communications Coordinator of the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Botanical Jargon, a concise and precise language for plants. We'd love for you to say hi in the chat and let us know what area you're joining us from. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitats through education, research, planting, and conservation programs. Our work is made possible primarily through the sales and renewals of the Florida State Wildflower License Plate. These funds, along with donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native wildflowers and plants throughout Florida. We'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the state wildflower license plate. And if you purchase or have the wildflower plate, you are eligible for a membership. So just let us know you have the tag and we'll get you set up in our database. Be sure to check out our website for resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where you can see wildflowers in bloom, for upcoming events, and more. We are also on social media, and you can find us on most platforms at FLA Wildflowers. Our next webinar on June 18th concludes our wonderful Botany in Context series with Using Keys to Florida Plants, presented by Dr. Jim Folsom. And stay tuned for many great field trips coming up. Our next field trip will be Friday, June 20th to Alligator Lake Recreation Area in Columbia County, and that's in Lake City, Florida. And you can come celebrate the summer solstice with me among the sunny blooms of American lotus. Also save the date for a refreshing adventure wading through Deep Creek in Putnam County on July 19th. We'll likely see several listed plant species in this rare Central Florida Atlantic white cedar hydric hammock. Be sure to follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, or check out flawildflowers.org/events to stay abreast of webinar and field trip opportunities. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are muted with cameras off. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature to submit them. The chat is active, but we do not monitor it for questions, so please use that Q&A. We'll address questions at the end of the talk as time permits, and if your question isn't answered, please feel free to email it to info@flawildflowers.org. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel in about 24 to 48 hours. When it is available, you'll receive an email from us with a link to the recording, along with a resource page with links for the webinar, from the webinar. And now to introduce our speaker. Hopefully many of you know this by heart at this point, but we may also have some new folks. So Dr. Jim Folsom's lifelong love of plants is reflected in a BS in botany from Auburn University, an MA in biology from Vanderbilt, and a PhD in research botany from the University of Texas at Austin. Though his research has largely centered on the orchid family, with much of that time spent in tropical America, including a year in Colombia on a Fulbright predoctoral fellowship, Jim's botanical interests are wide-ranging. For 35 years before his retirement in 2021 as curator and director of the Botanical Gardens at Huntington in San Marino, California, he dedicated much of his effort to educational programs that increase public interest and understanding of the science, culture, and history of plants and gardens. Topics reflected in his website, botanyin.context.com, as well as his TikTok channel, @botanyin.context. He lives on St. George Island with his wife, Deborah, also a botanist, and they have 2 adult children, Molly and James. Jim currently serves as an incoming member of the board of the American Horticultural Society. So with that, I will hand it over to Jim and give us just a moment to switch our screens.
Okay, hey, let's see now. Make sure I get choose the right one here. Keynote. And go to play. Ha. Well, it's good to be with you again. The lecture this week, or let's don't call it a lecture, let's call it a discussion, although I'm not getting a lot of feedback because it would be impossible with so many people. But the topic is botanical jargon or bountiful jargon, and it's become a favorite of mine. I took on these lectures not just because I have information I want to share, but in general, because these are topics I would like to explore more, and having the pressure of putting together a presentation causes me to spend a lot more time looking into these topics and learning more about them. And I've learned a lot about terminology and its history and its role. One of the interesting things that has occurred to me in this process is that um, people think in different ways. I guess some people must think musically and they're able to just think music, or people think mathematically. When I think, it's words and images paired up that roll through my mind. And so the more words I know, I think the more fluid or maybe confusing my thoughts can be. And whenever I start a topic, I always look and see what other realms say about the topic. So I checked into words. And of course, we all know Shakespeare's words, mere words, no matter from the heart. Um, and and in this, he's expressing the inadequacy of words to express emotions. Whereas Emily Dickinson, perhaps my favorite poet, was very clear on the power of words. A word is dead when it is said. Some say, I just say it begins to live that day. Um, I think that's echoed a bit by this quote from Oscar Wilde, that starting off with Shakespeare, words, mere words, but ending up with what a subtle magic there was in them. Words are powerful. But Francis Bacon, on the other hand, reminds us that before modern science, um, what we call science was deductive, and you started at the top and you just kind of came up with conclusions without any proof. And in his world, then the words were meaningless because there was nothing there to back them up. It was hollow information. And then much more recently, a Florida grad student who's now gone off to some other part, but a philosopher and a historian. Um, I can't get this out of the way. Normand tells us something more prosaic, and that is words in science can't be very emotional. And you can see this, the data should speak for themselves, not the words or the sound of the words or the emotion behind the words. So I'm sort of thinking about this, and then I have to check in with the linguists, because back in my youth, I signed up for the book club. And of course, anybody that signed up for the book club got themselves a compact edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, which challenges your eyesight. It comes with a little magnifying glass, which is inadequate at this stage of my life. But anyway, looking into what linguists say about words, a word's a lexeme, and then all of a sudden I run into this word, lemma. We used this word just last month when you know that lemma is one of the two perianth segments of a grass flower, that that the outer, the larger segment. And so lemma has a lot of different meanings, but in the world of lexicology, in the world of linguists, it is in a word that embraces all the different possible meanings of a single word, whereas lexeme is that meaning. And that means that what we all establish is an internal lexicon. We each have our set of meanings attached to words. And jargon then becomes a set of meanings that are shared by people in the specialty. So embrace jargon. It is the way you explore the specialty and the way you share meanings, and embrace what child behaviorists always tell us: learn to use your words. They are important. Well, that gets us to the current dilemma and to the topic. So I've gone through the introduction. Botanists reduce every thought and every deed to a term. So practically everything you do and everything you observe and everything you record and every conclusion you make is fraught with terminology. It's a world laden with technical meaning. Giving that some thought, in my own way of looking at it, terminology in botany is either taxonomic, you have nomenclatural things. Every plant name is a term. You have systematic things, families and categories, and how you arrange things. There's an analytical set of terminologies for anatomists who name parts, and physiologists who name process, and molecular biologists who name components. And then methodological, there's the mathematicians, the cladistic people who have enlightened our world with a whole bunch of new terms, synapomorphy and things like that. Physical, the geology people and the geography people, and experimental terminology for experimental biology. There's topical. This is kind of a smaller category, but every field has its name, and every field has its rituals and reports and how you write a report. And then the one that's most interesting to us today is descriptive. And that's what we're going to focus on. The terminologies we use to actually describe plants and determine the identities of plants. So let's move ahead. Now, for the naturalist, for most of us, describing a plant boils down to simple things. What can you touch and feel? What can you taste or smell? What do you see? And in the world of plants, not a whole lot about hearing, except I hear the cat trying to get in. So give me a second. Sorry, she locked herself out. So that means that you're looking at characteristics, the substance of a plant, the texture, that's the surface character, the color, whether it's transparent or opaque, the shape, form, symmetry, size, all of these ways you can describe or understand a plant are rife with terminology, the architecture, the position of things, the persistence, the ecology and distribution. Now, for the naturalists, those are, I think, straightforward. Botanists, however, have a much more formulaic way to approach this. There's such a thing as a description, and a description is a complete discussion and presentation of the characteristics of a plant. Diagnosis, you may have heard these two terms. A diagnosis is different. A diagnosis is a shortcut. A diagnosis may just be a few words. That is how you tell someone what differentiates one plant from another. So when people historically published plant descriptions for a new plant, you call it a description, but the part you Latinized to meet the needs of the rules is you Latinized the diagnosis. It looks like this, but it's different in these regards. So a diagnosis is more like a key characteristic, and a description is total. And once again, they fall into categories: the origin, where a part of a plant is attached and how it's arranged, what its shape and size is. What is it like inside and outside? What's the color, the chemistry, the seasonality? What kind of strategies do we observe? Do we know anything about the genetics and evolutionary relationships? Do we know anything about its geography and abundance? So it's so formulaic that there is a typical order. From Flora of North America, here we have, when you write a description, you start off with the general attributes. It's an herb, it's a tree. Then you go to its strategy. Is it monoecious, dioecious? Are the flowers perfect? And then its life strategy. Is it an annual, perennial, or using Ronquier's categories? Is it a therophyte? And then roots versus, and then you move to stems. And then you do the leaves, and you talk about their longevity, their structure. Then you do the inflorescence. You describe that. Then the flower, then the fruit, then the seed. And finally, if you know the chromosome number, you give that. And at the end, the flowering data and the habitat. Within those, there's also a procedure. You go from, with general features such as these are given first, but for particular structure, you give presence and then number. What's present? How many? Position, where is it? And then anything you know about its arrangement. Is it sealed to, grown to, like are the sepals grown together or grown to the petals? Are the petals adnate to the stamens? And then in each whole organ, You start with the color, the odor, the symmetry, the shape, the texture. I give you all of this because when you open a technical book, it's so much easier to read the description if you expect automatically that it's going to be formulaic. You don't have to kind of look at this mass of words and say, oh my gosh, how am I going to comprehend this? You say, I'm going straight to leaves, and leaves are always going to be after stems. So I want to see what the leaves look like. I want to see something about the flowers. So you don't have to wander through all of this technical material to get to one issue. Now, within a thing, it's this sequence. A leaf or a stem, you start at the base and you move to the apex, or from what's near to what's far, proximal to distal. And when you're looking at a leaf or a petal, you start with the underside, the abaxial, and then you describe the adaxial, the upper side. And these are expectations that just make it easier to write a description because you don't have to spell it out. You just move from point to point. And then the dimensions are always length width or length and height, and they're pretty much always metric. Now, let's look at some of the words that we run into. Here is the page from, most of you probably might have, at least Wonderland and Hansen's 2011 third edition of the Guide to Florida Plants. Here's the first page of the Asteraceae that takes you to the different keys. Look at the words you have to navigate. Heads ligulate, strap-like corolla, heads radiate, capillary or plumose bristles, pappus, plumose bristles, achene, filiform beaked, achene not filiform, columnar or fusiform. If you are not familiar with these terms, using a key is a pain because you're looking everything up. So just get accustomed to the idea that you're going to need to learn all this terminology, and you're going to want to learn it because it changes the way you think about these plants. Now, we're going to go through some terminology now, but I didn't want to just march through lists and lists and lists. That would wear us all out. So I'm grouping terminology based on the same topic we discussed just last month, which is, or a few months ago, big idea number 9, codicil, and that is plants only make roots, stems, and leaves. So we're going to move from terminology related to roots, to that related to stems, to that related to leaves. So roots are kind of understudied and undervalued. They hang out underground generally. And so there aren't a lot of different categories for that reason, but for another reason, roots don't have the intricate structure of stems. So here's buttresses. There's a buttress ficus from Hawaii. Here are pneumatophores, which are stem-like productions from the root system of taxodiums. Here are prop roots, like in corn, and then there's tap roots, and there's fibrous roots that they're tuberous roots that this is fascicles. They're all clustered together, but they're tuberous. They're real roots that have the quality of a tuber. But not everything underground is a root. Tillers, that's what the grass people call underground rhizomes for grasses. Rhizomes like an iris. So rhizomes are stems. And if they hug the ground or are underground, they typically are called rhizomes. If they skip across the ground, they might be called stolons or runners. A bulb is a little stem with leaves, but it's underground. So people tend to think of all these underground parts as aspects of roots, and there's a relationship, but anatomically, these are stems as a corm, like an elaeotris or an gladiolus, a stem, an expanded stem that not consisting of all of these scale leaves like a bulb. So there are these types of roots. If you look into recent literature, there's a wonderful publication that came out just last year by Steve Orzel and his team of people, his collaborators out of the University of Florida. And they studied 198 grassland special species in peninsular Florida. And these are understory to pine flatwoods and actually pyrrhic subclimaxes, places of fire managed landscapes. And I just want to show you this because all of a sudden you're challenged to know a lot of terminology. So he's talking about, he says there are several different categories of plants that show up here. There are caulescent herbs. Well, herb means that the above ground parts are not woody. Caulescent means that the stems bear leaves on. They have obvious stems. And then cespitous graminoids. So that would be anything that looks like a grass that is tufted. Cespitous means sessile or close to the earth and clustered and tightly bunched. And rosette herbs, so things like elytris, or a lot of composites that have a basal rosette and then send up a stalk. So, you just reading this, you have to have a lot. And then he gets into some words that I don't ever use or haven't ever used. I know the word epigynous, as in below the flower, but below the soil is epigyogenous. At least that's how I pronounce it. So plants with epigyogenous is above, meaning at the soil, and above is epi. Hypo is below. So hypogeogenous. So he's looking at plants with rhizomes that either are just at the surface of the ground, like the iris, or below the ground. And here he's showing us, so here's a hypoxis, a bulb with fibrous roots. And here's Rexia mariana. And I don't know if you've paid attention to that lovely little common wildflower, but Mariana grows in these colonies. It springs up everywhere, and you'll see that it varies from pink to white, but you can kind of figure out the extent of a rhizomatous colony by looking at the color of the flowers, and you'll see that all the ones this shade of lavender are in a cluster, and underground you can suspect that they're all connected. Okay, and then here's Asclepias connivens. That's the sort of stem with roots coming out of that. And then, of course, the strange, almost bulbous nature of Calopogon. Here in this picture, he's showing us one of the runner oaks. And look at this term. I love this. This is a woody geoxylic suffratex. Let's break that down. Well, woody, I think we have under control. There's a lot of xylem being produced, and it's probably got rings. Geoxylic. So that was a new word for me, a geoxyle. I guess that's how you pronounce it. And that's telling us that it's an underground wood. So it has a woody stem or root system underground, geoxylic. And then suffratex is just a word that ecologists use for low woody shrubby growth, like Ilex glabra and those kinds of, and the vacciniums that fill the floor of our pine forests. Those are all ecologically suffratex plants. And you can remember that based on the fact that sometimes it's laden with smilex, and you do a lot of suffratexing walking through there. Here's a plant of Ilex glabra. See that underground, the rhizomatous growth there that connects all those. And these plants all return from fire beautifully because they have these systems that are protected from the fire. And you cut them down or burn them down, and they just pop right up. Here is the Geobalanus, the gopher apple, pulled out of the ground. Over here, he's got some more. That's we looked at a larger version of that. So it's a really nice study. It's worth finding on the internet. I put the link to it in the notes. It's freely available. And wow, is it full of information about the plants that many of us are looking for out in the forest. Just another minute with stems. Here's some pictures I made. If you know Phabanthus, it is a spectacular plant. How would I describe it? Well, the stem is vergate. That's a wonderful, useful word in our world. Vergate means wand-like, and it moves with it. You touch it and it springs back. And so vergate is a really nice, it means long, skinny, and wand-like. Underground, it has this really curious white stem, so it's almost a tuber. I don't know, rhizome. And so that it's a really spectacular plant. One of my favorite daisies. Here is Rexia aliphanus, which is very common here in the Panhandle. Beautiful. It's the larger flowered of the different Rexias that we have. Um, it's very distinct. Underground, it's got a huge woody stem. I don't, no wonder after a burn or after some kind of cutting, you go out and one of the first things to spring up is all the Rexia aliphanus that are present. They have this massive, I've seen underground stems a foot long that and like 3 inches, 4 inches thick. So it's a surprising plant, but this has got alternate leaves that are linear. Um, this has opposite leaves that are either you would call those narrowly ovate or lanceolate. And then we have another kind of plant with a virgate stem, the elytras. This is Abovata and Lutea. These plants have creeping, very close rhizomes, and they have a rosulate or rose-like cluster of foliage at the base, and then the flowering stem that shoots straight up. And remember, in each case, we're looking at two kinds of stems. You have an underground rhizome stem and then a caulescent stem with leaves. Here you have this woody underground stem, and then the flowering stems are these caulescent stems. And here's the same. You've got a creeping rhizomatous short stem, and um, and then from the axils of the leaves, it sends up the flowering stalk with this flowering stem. Looking at the vestiture, which is a way of saying the hairiness or the texture of the surface of stems, here we have two different Pidiopsis. The word aspera means rough to the touch. So that's a nice clue to the fact that this Pidiopsis aspera has these almost scurfy looking short hairs that are, I believe you can look at, I believe they're actually stipitate glandular. They have little swollen tips on the hair that maybe are glandular. Compare that to the very common Pidiopsis graminifolia, and it's covered with hair too, but instead of being little erect short scabrous hairs, these are long and silky. So the term I would use for this plant is sericeous. Um, Sericeous comes from the word for silk. So when you see a lot of soft, kind of shining white hairs laying flat, then the word that botanists typically use for that is sericeous. Down below, I have a chrysopsis with alternate leaves, and look at the leaf shape there. It's sort of almost elliptic, maybe a little bit ovate, obovate, and alternate with these really long spidery trichomes that stick out. The word, when something sticks straight out, you use the word spreading. These are spreading hairs. Right next to it, I've pictured a stem of Hypericum setosum. And it's one of the few hypericums that actually is hairy. And so you could describe this as cetos. It's a little bit rough. Some people might call it hirsute, but the word cetos is a perfect word for this. To the right, I've got stems of Rexia virginica and Terricolon. Now, Rexia, of course, has opposite leaves, and Terricolon has alternate leaves. In this case, in both cases, what is perceived as leaf blade runs down the stem, and we have a word for that. We call it decurrent. All these words are in the notes, by the way, so if you don't have to remember all this. So this is decurrent tissue. In Rexia, it's decurrent along, making the stem almost feel like it's four-angled. In the Terricolon, you know that it's related to leaf tissue because on one side it's green and on the other side it's white hairy, just like this sort of tomentose or lanate undersurface of the leaves. So on the top, they're dark green. Underneath, they're covered with a thick mat of hairs. I would use the word lanate. but you might call it densely tomentose for that. Let's look at some stem structural types. The bulb, we've mentioned these, the cormels are just little corms, the rhizome and the iris. Here's the runner, also the stolon. When you have a stem that functions as a leaf, flattened and green, then there are many words for that, phylloclad or cladode. Stems can be tendrils, or stems can be spiny, in which case it's a thorn. And there are different agreements as to how you use these terms, but in my world, if it's a stem anatomically and spiny, it's a thorn. If it comes off of a stem, like in a rose, and it's really bark tissue, then it's a prickle. And if it's a leaf that is sharp pointed, it's a spine. So I distinguish between those. Some people are not as absolute in that regard. Of course, the crazy thing to me is swollen underground stems are called tubers. If it's a root and it's swollen, then you can't call it a tuber because a tuber is officially a stem. So you have to call it tuberous. So dahlias have tuberous roots, whereas potatoes make tubers. Arrangement is an aspect of stems. Here we have alternate, we've mentioned that, and opposite. But if you get opposite and then 90 degrees opposite and then back to the same, and so you basically have 4 ranks that shift 90 degrees with each node, then we have a special word for that. We don't just call it opposite, we call it decussate. If you have alternate leaves, but they're always on just 2 sides of the stem, like in grasses, then we call that disticus. Or if they're all coming from one point, like bedstraw, then we call it whorled. If you take this alternate leaf arrangement and compress it so that all the leaves create a fan like an iris, then we have a different term for that. It's equitant. So on and on and on. The nice thing about those terms is once you've mastered them, you don't have to explain the structure. You just use that one word. Equitant suffices instead of saying, oh yeah, it's got leaves on 2 sides of the stem and they all are compressed into this fan-like device. Now let's look at some more stems and move into leaves. So 2 composites, Ochlumina and Eupatorium. Kind of similar, but the Ochlumina has alternate leaves and the Eupatorium has opposite leaves. And if we look at the leaves, they're very similar. On the lower surface, we see that they're both sort of pubescent, heavily pubescent, and they both have raised veins with a reticulate. So you would describe these kind of similarly. You would say the veins are raised. It's a reticulate venation with raised veins and tomentose. What distinguishes these then is the leaf shape. So this leaf is somewhat elliptical. We'll get to this in a second, somewhat obovate. This leaf is broadly ovate. This one has an entire margin that is a little bit revolute, which means it's turned down, whereas this one is somewhat crenate, not sharp pointed, rounded, but I would call that irregularly crenate and get away with it. Another botanist might use a slight different terminology. So here's our leaf shapes. These are some standard ones. Cordiform, auriculiform, falciform. That's a leaf that has a natural bend in it. Hastiform, it's now called Hibiscus laevis, but it used to be called Hibiscus, I think, hastata, because the leaf shape is like this with the 2 pointed lobes. Lyrate, Salvia lyrata, peltiform, lotus. Reniform means it's shaped like a big fat kidney. Sagittariform, a lot of our plants have sagittate leaves, or spatulate, looking like a spatula. Position also and shape. This is involute when the edge of the leaf curls in. Here's revolute when the edge of the leaf curls under. or is thickened. You don't have to you don't have to guess at these. You can actually refer to a chart. And this is, you can get this chart from, I put the link in the notes. When I was at the Huntington, we took the chart that was published in Taxon in 1962, which botanists around the world have used. And we digitized it, but actually on a vector system. So it's available either as a drawing file or as a PDF. So you can download the PDF and you can see that across here are the ratios. So 1-to-1, circular or square. If it's basally larger, then it's ovate. If this is the base and that's the apex, and that's the way we always do things in botany, then if it's larger apically, then we call it obovate. If it's sort of diamond shaped, we use the word rhombic. If it's shaped like a tie, like an old-fashioned wide tie with a broadness here and kind of squared off like that, we use the word trullate. And if it's reversed, then it's obtrullate. And if it's purely triangular, we call it deltoid. If it's more equal and then the more it becomes narrower, it's triangular, narrowly triangular. So you can actually use this chart, and it's not perfect because no leaf subscribes to some graphic artist's idea of perfection. But here we have 4 sets of leaves: Sorilla, Cliftonia, Plethora, and Itea. And I would call these narrowly obovate to elliptic. I would call the Cliftonia trullate to obovate. Plethora is clearly obovate to elliptical, broadly elliptical. And the Itea is more perfectly elliptical. But notice these are all from, each of these is from one plant. So when you describe leaf shape and even margins, you have to give yourself some latitude because they're not going to be perfectly the same from plant to plant and even within a plant. Here's some more. Cockaloba, Rincosia, which is one I love that plant. This is the Dioscorea bulbifera, having been eaten by the bug they released to try to limit its spread. Skeletonized. The Ipomea sagittata you find around the edges of swamps, the native plant, a curious native, has perfectly sagittate, narrowly sagittate leaves. Of course, sassafras is famous for having leaves of various shapes. And then we have the highly not compound. This is just short of being compound. It's really crazy. Ambrosia. So let's move on and look at some leaf patterns. So we know that you can have palmate leaves, bipalmate, which means that it's twice palmate, even tripalmate, pinnate leaves. If there's no terminal leaflet, we have a term for that. Parapinnate. If there is a terminal leaflet, it's imparapinnate. And then we have structural types: the pitcher, spathe, sporophyll, tendril. So there's names for all these wonderful things. And back to this, now let's look at 3 compound leaves. And what you need to know when you read the descriptions is that in a compound leaf, you draw an outline around the entire leaf to determine or establish the shape. So even though this is Telia with 3 leaflets, the shape I would call broadly ovate, widely depressed ovate, or widely ovate. And then you have to describe the leaflets. Here with, oh gosh, the legumes, you'll come back to me in a second. Anyway, it's basically deltoid. But then you have to describe the leaflets. And here with Chamaecrista, the leaf is almost oblong, because the final leaflets tapers down some, but it's almost oblong. And there aren't a lot of leaves that you can use the word oblong for. I'd tend to use the word oblong just so I could get away with it. And of course, then structural leaves, we have the trumpets, the pitchers, Sarracenia flava, Sarracenia rosea, and then these wonderfully filiform leaves of Drosera tracei with these sticky capitate uh, hairs, the glandular hairs. Now, here are two genera to look at, or the Eupatorium. I think Eupatorium is like the mockingbird of plants because it just keeps looking like other plants. This one is Meconoides that looks like Mecania with the opposite leaves, but look at that deltoid leaf that looks like a Mecania leaf. And then we have Rotundifolium, once again, with those broadly ovate crenate leaves. And then down here we have this incredibly crazy perfoliate leaf, which means that the two leaves opposite join together and the stem appears to perforate the leaf mass. And in the background, I've put Helianthus radula just because it's such a crazy plant. We've talked about margins. Here's a chart to margins. I included this. These charts came from an ancient textbook, which I've cited in the notes, put out in '74 by the people in North Carolina. Vascular Plant Systematics. It's just this huge, thick resource book to terminologies and methods, a lot of which is outdated now. There's nothing in it about cladistics, for example, but it's full of useful descriptions and a lot of line drawings that help you through ciliate, cleft, crenate, crenulate. So if it's crenate, it's that, but if it's smaller, then you change the ending and it's crenulate. Here's dentate and denticulate. Serrate and doubly serrate. Erose would be like more jagged. So there's a term for almost everything. When you're out in the wild, it's hard, though, to make some of these terms work. Here's a beautiful violet that is an undescribed species, and it has younger leaves that are purely cordate, that are very violet-like. But as they get older, they become more like palmata or some of the woodland violets with the deep, almost trilobed or palmate aspect to them. And then, of course, nodosculus. The shape of the leaf the overall shape doesn't include these indentations. So to get the overall shape with a truncate base and a wily depressed ovate shape, and then you have to describe how the lobing works. Here are some terms for apices. You do the base and then you do the apex. Acuminate means it's sort of stretched out. Acute means it's just angular. Aristate means there's a long kind of a pointed aspect. If it feels like a tail, then it's caudate as in tail. If it's just a little bit depressed at the tip, then it's emarginate. If it's deeper, it's cleft. And so all these terms come into use and nothing is perfect. So I would call the tip of the violet leaf acute. And the base is heavily auriculate, deeply auriculate, which means eared. And then we have some wonderful things about texture. Here's Chaptalia. In the books, they describe Chaptalia as being without hairs, or they use the word glabrate, which means it loses its hairs. And it does lose the hairs on the upper leaf surface, on the adaxial side, but not immediately. The reason they're described like this, I think, is that most descriptions in books are actually based on herbarium specimens, and they even tell you that. These measurements and descriptions are based on dried specimens. Well, by the time you've made a specimen of this, you've lost a lot of these hairs on the upper surface. You don't lose the bottom surface. It's heavily volutinous or lanate or heavily tomentose on the lower surface. But if you walk out in the field the way to spot Chaptalia is by the white hairs on the upper leaf surface. You can't miss it. But that doesn't show up in the description. So the field naturalist has different challenges from the herbarium botanist. I mean, it's good to be both, right? I want to take you and take one plant and just spend a couple of minutes with it. So a resource that's really useful for all of us is the ISB, the Plant Atlas, the Florida Plant Atlas. It treats the genera, it shows you a distribution. This is the genus Helianthus. Here's the distribution. And just because it's not in those counties doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that they didn't have specimens from those counties. But almost certainly there are Helianthus in those 3 counties. So it's a plant that occurs throughout the state of Florida. Okay. They give you pictures of herbarium specimens. So I've chosen all of the Helianthus that are considered native. Helianthus carnosus with these long linear leaves. Helianthus debilis, the one that's here on the island, with these triangular, almost deltoid leaves with a truncate base and somewhat hispid the texture. And then we have Helianthus divaricatus with these lanceolate leaves that are kind of curled at the tip, cirrus they would call it, as compared to the very leathery and smooth, glabrous is the word, Helianthus floridanus. Contrasted with the crazy Helianthus heterophyllus with these really hispid means like a day-old beard, bristly leaf surfaces that vary greatly from the base of the plant to the tip and from plant to plant, which means heterophilus is a great name for that. And then the hairy Helianthus hirsutus suggesting a kind of a bristly, hairy nature. Microcephalus, which means little-headed, with these huge lower, strongly dentate leaves and then smaller leaves up in the inflorescence. Occidentalis with these, notice this has got a clean petiole, whereas this petiole has decurrent leaf tissue along the edge. And that brings us to radula, which looks in the field much more distinctive than it does here in these herbarium specimens. But that's going to be either broadly elliptic or perhaps you might, I wouldn't call that ovate. I would call that broadly elliptic. Okay. And then resinosus. But this one caught my eye. This is Helianthus strumosus. And it caught my attention because that specimen on the left was collected by Andrew Kluel, and this specimen on the right was collected by Robert Godfrey. And in both cases, they did not know what they had collected. Kluel collected this at Tall Timbers. Godfrey collected this in Leon County. And these were great taxonomists. So the fact that they didn't know them, and in both cases, they asked for help. So Kluel sends it to Wunderlin, and he says, please drop me a card with your determination. Is it hirsutus? And Godfrey just puts Helianthus and sends it to Wunderlin. And this is called an annotation. So when another botanist determines something or makes a statement about something, they stick a little slip on it. It's called an annotation slip. And so here's Wunderlin identifying both of these in 1976. Now, I didn't know strumosus. It's an Eastern North American plant that just creeps into Florida. And so I thought, I wonder where that name comes from, because the way I help myself remember plant names is I find out something about the history. So I looked up strumosus, and the world has changed now. When you go search something on the internet, you get the AI version. And let me tell you, sometimes it's wonderful, but one word's difference in how you pose the question, you will get 2 totally different answers. So I asked, and I got strumosus is a Latin word meaning having a struma or having a scrofulous swelling of the glands. It can refer to a plant or a fish. In medicine, it refers to a condition called scrofula. Okay. And I thought, well, I wonder if it got its name from that. So I went and checked out all of the ancient, it was named by Linnaeus. It was in 1753 Species Plantarum. So I went and checked out, here's Linnaeus's description, Helianthus, and he calls it strumosus. And so I went and found all of these sources, Bocco and Morrison, and I looked at all these to see if anybody mentioned anything medicinal about it. It was driving me crazy. Linnaeus had published a book on medicinal botany, so nothing was said. Then I rephrased the question, and I got the etymology of Helianthus strumosus is a combination of Greek and Latin words describing the features. The epithet is from the Latin and means having soft swellings or cushioned. And then I looked in the flora of Florida, and I found out that it has basal swellings on the stem, but you will not find that in the description. You'll just find it in the explanation of the name. So I now need to see a living plant with strumosus to see what they're talking about. But apparently, there's no evidence it was ever considered a medicinal plant, even though the word also refers to a disease. So let's move quickly for just a minute to flowers and fruit. We're not going to spend any time on flowers except just to look at form, because all the previous lectures and next month's lecture on keys will spend a lot of time dealing with flowers. But I do want to just share this with you. There are these wonderful words that relate to the shapes of flowers. Lizzie Harper, a British artist, gave me permission to use this lovely kind of charming drawing of flower forms, showing funnel form, salver form, which has a tube and then it spreads abruptly, and labiate or bilabiate, bell-shaped, campanulate, rotate, which means it's symmetrical, radially symmetrical, papilionaceous, like a pea, galleate, which means it's hooded. So and here, these terms have not changed. This is from an 1897 book by Asa Gray on lessons in botany. And here are his drawings for funnel form, salver form, rotate, and bell-shaped, campanulate, and labiate. And then this is labiate spurred, showing a spur. So the good thing about plant terms is if you are a botanist today reading a description written 150 years ago, they have been so stable that you probably can understand and appreciate that description. Finally, just the last thing I want to do is I want to take one plant that you all will know, and I want to delve into much more about the terminology we use with that plant and the structure of that plant. So let's look at what's the genus Polygula. Once again, the cat has. I'm sorry, she goes out and then she locks herself out and she's not happy until she gets back in. Okay, so here's the genus Polygula as published by Linnaeus in 1753 in a class he calls, or subclass he calls Octandria, which means it's got 8 stamens. Now, this is his description: Polygula floribus, cristatus, spicatus, stem, herbaceous stem, so flowery, crisped, a spike with a herbaceous stem, branching, erect, alternate leaves that are subulate. And so that was from Morrison. That's how Morrison described it, or how Linnaeus described it. And then Morrison is from Maryland. The leaves are kind of narrow. The spike is parva, means somewhat, somewhat compact. And he says the flowers are carneous, which would be kind of rosy red. So that can't possibly be right, because they're not at all pink or red. Well, for the genus, yes. And that would be for, that's incarnata. So incarnata is named for the fact, incarnata, this is incarnata here, is named for the color incarnate, because not for the fact that it looks like a cross, but from the fact that it's colored the same as Asclepius incarnata. So here's that color, and that's how they're using to describe that. So that's the genus. Now, let's talk specifically about Polygula lutea, or what we now call Seneca lutea. So here's a plant of Polygula lutea out in the field. Here's Linnaeus's original description, 1753, Polygula floribus uh, imberberis oblongo-capitatus, stem erect, herbaceous, simple, leaves lanceolate, acute. And that was from a book he published. And then this is from John Ray's book. This is Plukenet's Amagus, which was a book of drawings. And here's Pettiver's book. So these were people publishing plants in England from America about the time Linnaeus was active. So and this means it's full sun. Okay. Linnaeus's genus Polygula included these 22 species in his original book. Most of those are no longer in the genus Polygula. So let's go look at the flora of North America. Here's Polygula lutea, and this is the treatment from maybe 10 or 15 years ago by Richard Abbott. Now, things have changed. In 2023, Polygula lutea was pushed back into a genus that was created in the 1800s called Seneca. And it's now Seneca lutea, and the authors are J.F.B. Pastore and J.R. Abbott. So Abbott wrote that original description, but now as of 2023, all the plants that were still being considered polygula in the Americas, pretty much all of those are now in the genus Seneca. There are no polygulas native to the Americas anymore. Now, let's go back and look at, well, where did the name Seneca come from? So it's fascinating. This is a publication. Linnaeus had a habit of writing the dissertations for his students. They got the credit and their doctorate, but he did the major work. And so he did a medical treatment on the root, the Seneca root, okay, Polygula seneca, which he named Polygula seneca in 1753, but this is in 1749. So that he wrote this treatment, and it's kind of crazy. He describes the snakes that might bite you, and he describes the way this plant might be used as a cure, all based on a famous publication by John Tennant in 1741, in which he describes the fact that the Seneca Indians used this root to treat snake bites. All fabricated, of course, but still there it is. And so it became a famous plant. Linnaeus named it Polygula seneca for the Seneca snake root. And then in the 1830s, a French botanist decided it was really going to be in a separate genus, and he named the genus Seneca, and he renamed the species Seneca officinalis. So that plant, which is not native to Florida, but native to Eastern North America, is now Seneca officinalis and is the type for the genus Seneca. And so what is the difference between Seneca and Polygula? This is crazy. The flowers are so small. This structure in the Seneca flower and this structure in the Polygula flower is only 1 to 3 millimeters long. I mean, we're talking minuscule. Even with a hand lens, you have trouble seeing this. This is called the keel. It is a third petal. There are 3 petals in Polygula and Seneca. It is a petal that has a long claw to it and then an expansion. And in Seneca, that expansion is all around the edge like fingers digitate. Whereas in Polygula, that expansion comes from one point and is fimbriate. So that distinguishes this tiny little petal. Here it is right here. You can see the fingering comes off the whole edge of the expansion in Seneca. In both, the anthers are attached to the petals, and there are 8 of them. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. And in both, or especially in Seneca, 2 of the sepals are extraordinarily large, and they form the basis of the flower. So when you look at a Seneca, i.e. polygula flower, what you see is this tube of the keel and 2 tiny petals sticking out, and then these 2 large sepals, which are called wings. Here's one. And the things that are most important is you get these 2 wings, and then this is the ovary of the plant. It's a little flat, lentil-like ovary with a style and then stigmatic surfaces. And that's what they look like. I mean, we're talking that whole dimension is like a millimeter. So it's pretty minuscule. This is all done with a microscope. Thank gosh someone in Brazil had the tenacity to do hundreds of these pictures. So let's go to the description now from Flora North America of Senegaludia. And remember that it's going to follow an order. You're going to go from 1 through 9. You're going to cover the attributes, the strategy, the life strategy, roots and stem, leaves, inflorescence. And you're going to follow in these, you're going to go from the base to the apex, from the close to the far, from the lower side of the leaf to the upper side of the leaf. You're going to follow this order. And then in the specific protocol, you're going to go, here it is, enlarged, adaxial to abaxial. This is when you sign on to do a treatment for Flora of North America, these are the instructions you receive as to how you write a description. So let's look at our polygula, our Seneca. That's 10 centimeters. So this plant that I dug up and washed is just barely 20 centimeters tall. Okay. I broke away some of the florets up here so you could see in here. And this is what's really fascinating to me. When you look at a capitulum, a head of Polygula lutea or Senegaludia, I can't make myself to say Seneca. The fresh flowers are only up here. These are fresh flowers. This is a maturing fruit. That's a maturing seed. Each ovary turns into a little flat disc that has 2 black seed in it. Okay. So they hang on to these while the ovary develops, these wings persist, these 2 sepals persist. So that's why you get these huge heads. When you look at a head of a polygula, only the top part is freshly flowering. All of these are persistent sepals as the ovary develops, and then they peel off, and this can keep growing. Richard Abbott recorded 1 head of a flowering raceme of polygula that was 10 centimeters long. In other words, it was as long as this half of this plant. So these can last much of the season. And since the color remains and the sepals remain, they're quite showy. But let's look a bit closer. So it's an herb, biennial. Either it's a biennial or a short-lived perennial. Biennial means that it germinates and grows in one season and flowers in the next and probably dies. It's single or multi-stemmed. There's the height in decimeters. It's unbranched or branched distally. That means toward the end. From a taproot or a fibrous root cluster. The stems are erect, sometimes laxly. So that means that very often you'll find a plant where the stems kind of lay on the ground. Nearly decumbent, that means they lay flat on the ground. Glabrous, that means the stems have no hairs. They're smooth. The leaves are usually, there's usually a basal rosette. The leaves are alternate in arrangement. They're either sessile, which means there's no petiole, or subsessile, or they may have a narrow petiola-like region that's only 1 to 2 millimeters. The basal blades are obovate, oblanceolate, or spatulate. That would be spatulate. Cauline, the leaves up the stem become narrowly ovate or near linear distally. So from the base to the tips, the leaves become more and more like the bracts and inflorescence. And he gives the size. They're somewhat succulent. The base is cuneate. That means angular. The apex is bluntly rounded to obtuse or acute, especially distally. The surfaces are glabrous, so there's no hairs on either the ab or the adaxial surface. And so he's using terms that we've related to from this chart. The racemes are capitate, head-like. And there's the side. See, here's where he tells us that the peduncle, that's the part that bears the flowers, can be as much as 10 centimeters in some specimens. The bracts here are deciduous, the little bracts at the base of the flowers. Narrowly lanceolate, that's those bracts. The pedicels are winged. So there's the pedicel is the little stalk. This is the peduncle, and the pedicel is the stalk that supports the flower. And the sepals, actually, sepal tissue is decurrent on the pedicel, so they're winged. They're glabrous. There's no hairs. The flowers. So here's a photo of a fresh flower that I took the other day. There are the two wings, the sepals. That is one of the other. There are 5 sepals. There are 2 big ones and 3 small ones. And then this is the combined 3 petals that make up the keel and the 2 normal lateral petals. And from the Abbott publication, the Pastori Abbott publication, here is a clearing and a magnification of that flower. This is Polygola lutea from that publication. So these are, let's see, the A, the B are the bracts. These are the bracts that were in the inflorescence. C and D are the upper and lower sepals. Here we have, well, this is the lateral petals and the stamens attached. That's the whole structure. And here is the ovary, the style, and the stigma. And there's just that keel petal with the fringed edge. Here is 1 sepal of the wings, and here are 2 sepals. This is after the flower has been shed, and you have the developing ovary and the 2 sepals. And then here's a maturing ovary. And that's just that crest from the top of there. That's 1 millimeter. So that whole structure is barely 3 millimeters long. Then we move to seed. The seed are very tiny, 1 to 1.6 millimeters. They're pubescent. They've got some hairs on them. There's an aril. That means there's a fleshy growth, suggesting that maybe the seed can be ant dispersed. They've got a lobing, and so in the phenology, they flower spring and fall nearly year round. The habitat is moist to wet soils, pine flatwoods, and they occur in almost all of Florida. Anybody who lives down at the tip, tell me if you've ever seen it down there, because they're not recorded from those 2 counties. So that's about all I want to lay down on you today about terminology, but you can see how the terminology is not only important in being able to accurately draw a mental picture of a plant, but it's important in your formulation of how you think of a plant, because you can think of those characteristics and you've got a word for them. So I want to thank the people at Florida Wildflower Foundation who've helped me through this process, and thank all the people who've given me permission to collect. Thank Richard Abbott for not only sending me the article, because there was a paywall. I didn't want to pay for it, and he sent me a PDF copy of that article, but he's also been very cordial and responded several times to questions I had. Lizzie Harper very sweetly sent me a nice file of her picture. And then, of course, Alan, Ethan, David, and Donnie are always ready to help. David went through my whole slideshow for me and made sure I corrected all my spellings. So thank you very much, and I will sign off. Let's see, stop share.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was wonderful. Excuse me. Like many of these topics, they're so dense, so we'll definitely be revisiting, but I have so appreciated how you have organized them and put them into a context that makes it really understandable. since we have gone a little over in time and we just have 2 questions, we'll follow up with those offline. But we hope to see everyone again for our final webinar in this series in June on using keys, the botanical keys for Florida. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay.